Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I stood in the middle of my office, the air thick with the stench of dust, sweat, and something far worse, the undeniable scent of failure, of betrayal, of everything I had poured my heart and soul into being reduced to nothing. The once bustling workspace, the place where I had spent years grinding through sleepless nights, where deals were made, where I had watched my dream take shape with my own hands, was now a graveyard of shattered glass, overturned desks, and abandoned chairs. The computers were missing. The filing cabinets had been emptied. The walls were bare where my framed achievements had once hung, mocking me now with their absence. But the worst part wasn't the destruction itself. It was the silence, the absence of my employees, the hollow echo of a business that had been gutted from the inside out. I moved toward my desk, my footsteps heavy against the floor, my mind replaying the events of the last few months, searching for the moment when it had all started to unravel, trying to pinpoint the first crack in the foundation I had believed was unshakable. The bank had called me that morning, their tone professional, but laced with something I had never expected to hear: pity. The accounts were empty, not drained overnight, not the result of some catastrophic mistake, but methodically emptied over time, small enough transactions to avoid triggering red flags, large enough to bleed the business dry before I could stop it. I should have noticed it sooner, should have seen the signs, should have questioned the late payments, the missing invoices, the slight discrepancies in payroll that I had brushed off as clerical errors. But I had trusted my team, trusted the people I had built this with, trusted him. And that was my biggest mistake. As I lowered myself into my chair, I reached for the folder I had been clutching since I left the bank, my fingers trembling slightly as I flipped it open, scanning the printed statements, the transactions that told a story so clear, so deliberate, that I almost laughed at the sheer audacity of it. The money hadn't vanished. It hadn't been stolen by some faceless hacker or siphoned away through an elaborate scam. No, it had gone somewhere specific, to my brother Ryan. The realization hit me harder than the financial loss itself, harder than the destroyed office, harder than the knowledge that my company, my life's work, was beyond saving. My own brother, the person I had grown up with, the person I had protected, the person I had defended against everyone who said he was nothing more than a selfish, entitled parasite, had been stealing from me for months, maybe even longer. My stomach twisted, my breathing shallow, my vision blurring slightly as the betrayal settled deep into my bones. This wasn't just about money. This wasn't just about greed. This was personal. Ryan had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the one our parents had lavished with praise while I had been the one expected to be responsible, to work hard, to earn every bit of recognition I ever received. He had coasted through life on charm and manipulation, using people, taking what he wanted, never once facing real consequences, because someone was always there to clean up the mess he left behind. And now, he had taken everything from me, and for what? Some twisted sense of satisfaction? A petty attempt to prove that, no matter how much I succeeded, he would always be one step ahead, one move away from knocking me down? The door creaked open behind me, breaking the suffocating silence, and I didn't even have to turn around to know who it was. His footsteps were too familiar, his arrogance practically radiating off him before he even spoke. "Wow," Ryan said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy, the same voice he used whenever he wanted to pretend he cared about something. "Looks like things really fell apart, huh? Must be tough watching everything you built just vanish like that." I exhaled slowly, pressing my fingers against my temples, forcing myself to stay calm, to keep my anger in check, to not give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. "You did this," I said, my voice steady but low, controlled, dangerous in a way I had never spoken to him before. "You stole from me. You sabotaged me. And now, you're standing here, acting like this is some kind of accident?" Ryan let out a small laugh, stepping further into the office, casually running his fingers over the back of one of the remaining chairs like he owned the place. "Stole?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow, shaking his head like the idea was absurd. "Come on, Danny, don't be dramatic. It's not like you couldn't afford to lose a little. You always acted like you were some genius businessman, like you were so much better than the rest of us. Consider it balance." Balance. That word sent a white-hot fury through me, a slow burn that started in my chest and spread through every nerve in my body, settling deep, dangerous, and unforgiving. He didn't see this as theft, as destruction, as the calculated betrayal that it was. He saw it as justified, as if I had somehow deserved this, as if taking what was mine was his right. I pushed my chair back, standing slowly, leveling my gaze at him, watching as his smirk flickered slightly, just for a second, just enough for me to see that he wasn't entirely sure how far he had pushed me. "You think this is over?" I asked, my voice low, measured, carrying the kind of certainty that made his smirk finally falter. "You think you won? You destroyed my business, Ryan. You think I'm just going to sit back and let you walk away like nothing happened?" He tilted his head slightly, his confidence returning, his signature smirk settling back into place. "What are you going to do, Danny? Start over? Build it all again from scratch? Hate to break it to you, but you don't have the resources to fight me on this. You're broke. And me? Well," he pulled out his phone, flashing the screen at me, a bank account balance, my money now sitting under his name. "I'm doing just fine." That was the moment I truly understood. He hadn't done this for the money. He had done it because he wanted me to fail. I nodded slowly, inhaling deeply, calming myself, letting my anger settle into something sharper, something colder, something much, much more dangerous than blind rage. "You're right," I said, watching as he blinked, confusion flickering in his expression. "I can't rebuild what you took. I can't undo the damage you've done." Then, I stepped closer, lowering my voice just enough to send a chill down his spine. "But I can destroy you, Ryan. And I will." For the first time, his confidence cracked. And I knew this was just the beginning. I sat in my car for a long time, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my breath coming out in slow, controlled exhales as I forced myself not to go back into that office and do something I'd regret. The rage burning inside me wasn't the kind that came in short bursts, not the kind that faded after a few hours or even a few days. It was something deeper, something sharper, something that settled into my bones and refused to let go. Ryan had taken everything from me, and worse than that, he had stood there and smiled about it, like it was some kind of twisted game, like my years of work meant nothing to him, like I was nothing to him. But Ryan had always been this way, hadn't he? The golden child, the one who could do no wrong. The one who could crash our father's car at 17 and somehow convince our parents that I was the bad guy for not covering for him. The one who barely scraped by in college but still landed a high-paying job because of our father's connections. The one who had never faced consequences a single day in his life because there was always someone standing behind him, ready to clean up his mess. And now he had done the one thing I couldn't forgive. I needed answers. I needed to know how far this went, how deep the betrayal ran, how many people had stood by and watched him do this to me without saying a single word. And I knew exactly where to start. I pulled out of the parking lot, gripping the wheel a little too tightly, forcing myself to drive with something resembling control as I made my way to the only place that still felt like enemy territory, even after all these years, my parents' house. The driveway was exactly the way it had always been. The neatly trimmed hedges perfectly maintained, the porch spotless, the front door standing tall like the entrance to a world I had never truly belonged to. I walked up the steps, taking a slow breath before ringing the doorbell, already knowing that whatever conversation was about to happen inside this house wasn't going to end well. When my mother opened the door, her expression flickered through a series of emotions so fast I almost missed them. Surprise, discomfort, something close to guilt, but then it settled into carefully measured concern, the kind she had perfected over years of pretending she cared about things she never really did. "Daniel," she said, her voice light, forced, like she was trying to pretend this was a casual visit. "What a surprise. We weren't expecting you." I stepped past her without waiting for an invitation. The familiarity of the house making my stomach twist, the memories pressing down on me like a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. I said, keeping my tone flat, controlled, dangerous. "I figured you wouldn't be." She closed the door behind me, exhaling softly, already bracing for whatever was coming next. "I assume this is about Ryan?" she asked, her voice quieter now, careful, like she already knew where this was going. I turned to face her, jaw tight, heart pounding in my chest like a war drum. "You knew," I said, the accusation hanging in the air between us, heavier than anything else in this house. "Didn't you?" She swallowed hard, looking away for just a second, just long enough to confirm everything I needed to know. "It's not that simple, Daniel," she said finally, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "We didn't." "Don't." I cut her off, my voice sharp, filled with a kind of fury I had never aimed at her before. "Don't stand there and lie to me. Don't insult me like that. You knew what he was doing. You knew he was bleeding me dry, and you let him." She let out a slow breath, her hands gripping the back of the chair beside her, her shoulders tense, like she was trying to figure out how to spin this, how to make me feel like I was overreacting. "Your father didn't want to get involved." she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper now. "He said it was between you two, that you'd work it out." "And Ryan." She hesitated, choosing her next words carefully, like she was stepping through a minefield. "Ryan promised it wasn't as bad as it seemed." I let out a cold, bitter laugh, shaking my head, finally understanding what I had always suspected. "Of course," I said, my voice dripping with disbelief. "Because Ryan always tells the truth, right? Because Ryan has never lied to get what he wants, never manipulated anyone, never convinced you to look the other way while he screwed people over." She flinched slightly, but she didn't deny it, didn't even try, because we both knew the truth. My father might have washed his hands of it, but my mother had chosen to stand by and do nothing, chosen to let it happen, chosen to protect him over me, just like she always had. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head, stepping back toward the door, my mind racing, my body thrumming with a kind of rage I had never felt before. "You know what?" I said, voice low, dangerous. "It doesn't even matter. You made your choice. You let him do this. And now, you're going to have to live with what comes next." Her eyes widened slightly, panic flickering across her face, her hands tightening around the chair. "Daniel, what are you going to do?" I turned back, my expression unreadable, my voice deadly calm. "Whatever I have to." And then I walked out, slamming the door behind me, feeling the weight of that house lift off my shoulders for the first time in years. I didn't just want my business back anymore. I wanted revenge. Ryan had taken everything from me, and now I was going to return the favor. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through my contacts, my fingers hovering over a name I hadn't called in a very long time. Then, without hesitation, I pressed dial. The voice on the other end picked up almost instantly, their tone sharp, professional, dangerous in a way that sent a thrill down my spine. "Daniel Carter," they said, a small chuckle following my name. "Didn't think I'd hear from you again. What do you need?" I took a slow breath, my grip tightening on the phone, my pulse steady, my mind already 10 steps ahead. "I need a favor," I said, my voice steady, certain. "And I needed to ruin someone." A pause. Then, finally, the answer I was waiting for. "Tell me everything." I sat in my apartment, the room dimly lit by the soft glow of my laptop screen, my fingers moving methodically over the keyboard as I pieced together the puzzle that would completely unravel Ryan's life. I had spent the last 48 hours diving deep into his professional world, combing through financial reports, scanning corporate filings, and analyzing every single deal his company had pushed through in the last few years. And then, buried under layers of numbers, buried within documents that were never meant to be seen by anyone outside his carefully curated circle, I found it, the smoking gun. A bank transfer, subtle but undeniably illegal. A shell company registered in a country where financial oversight was nothing more than a joke. A pattern of funds being moved from one account to another, under names that didn't match, invoices that made no sense, payments that had no legitimate reason to exist. It was all there, hidden beneath layers of deception, carefully disguised under the illusion of business as usual. But to someone like me, someone who had spent years running an honest company, someone who knew exactly what real financial reports were supposed to look like, it stood out like a neon sign flashing fraud. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, my heart pounding not from fear, but from the sheer adrenaline of knowing that I now held the perfect weapon in my hands. Ryan had sabotaged me, stolen from me, destroyed everything I had built, and he had done it because he believed that he was untouchable, that no one would ever turn the tables on him. But he had underestimated me. He had assumed that I would crawl away and lick my wounds, that I would take my loss and disappear like every other person he had used and discarded over the years. He had no idea who he was dealing with. I picked up my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I needed, my fingers steady as I typed out a simple message. "I have something for you. Interested?" The response came less than 5 minutes later. "Always. Send details." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I opened an encrypted email service, carefully crafting an anonymous tip, attaching just enough evidence to raise alarms, but not enough to make it obvious who had sent it. The message was clean, to the point, written in the kind of language that would make any competent corporate executive's stomach drop. "Recent transactions within your company suggest fraudulent activity involving senior management. Attached are preliminary findings. Suggest further internal audit before authorities become involved." I hit send, knowing exactly what would happen next. Ryan's company would panic. They would scramble to make sense of the allegations, to determine whether the tip had merit, to figure out who was watching them, who was pulling at the loose thread that could unravel everything. And Ryan, sitting so comfortably in his high-rise office, believing that he had won, would start to feel the first whispers of uncertainty. But I wasn't done yet. Leaning forward, I pulled up a different platform, one designed for rumors, industry gossip, the kind of information that spread faster than official reports ever could. I crafted a carefully worded post, something vague enough to avoid immediate dismissal, but damning enough to start whispers in all the right places. Hearing chatter about a major financial scandal brewing in a top-tier firm. Sources suggest internal fraud at an executive level. Watch for sudden resignations soon. And just like that, the seeds of destruction were planted. By the time Ryan sensed that something was wrong, the storm was already gathering speed. It started small, just a few little shifts in his world, small enough that he might have dismissed them at first, but noticeable enough to make him uneasy. The first crack appeared when he walked into a meeting expecting the usual reception, deference, respect, the subtle but obvious acknowledgement that he was someone powerful. But instead, there was something different in the way his colleagues greeted him, a hesitation that hadn't been there before, a certain wariness in their expressions, like they had heard something and weren't sure if they should be standing too close. Then came the questions from higher-ups, subtle but pointed, inquiries about accounts that should have been routine, numbers that should have gone unnoticed, deals that had already been closed but were suddenly being reviewed again. Ryan wasn't stupid. He knew something was happening. He just didn't know who was pulling the strings. I was sitting in a coffee shop when I got the first call. The number was unfamiliar, but the second I answered, the voice on the other end made my pulse quickly sharpen with interest. Daniel Carter? The voice was smooth, professional, carrying the kind of quiet authority that came with experience. This is Jordan Ellis from the Financial Ledger. I'm working on a developing story, and your name came up. I took a slow sip of my coffee, keeping my voice calm, controlled, unreadable. Is that so? There was a brief pause, the kind that was calculated, deliberate, designed to make me uncomfortable, but it didn't work. There's been some interesting movement in certain corporate circles, Jordan continued, clearly choosing his words carefully. We've been hearing things, whispers of internal fraud, potential regulatory violations. Some say it might involve a high-level executive at Lockwood Enterprises. Your brother, Ryan Carter, is a senior VP there, isn't he? I smiled slightly, even though he couldn't see it, my fingers tapping lightly against the table. I suppose he is, I said, my tone giving away nothing. Would you care to comment on any of these rumors? Jordan asked, his voice laced with curiosity, with the kind of hunger for a story that I could use to my advantage. I leaned back, letting the silence stretch just long enough for him to wonder what I was thinking, just long enough for him to want the answer more. I can't say I know much about Ryan's business dealings, I said finally, my voice smooth, calculated. But if I were you, I'd keep looking. Sometimes, when smoke appears, there's more than just a little fire. A beat of silence. Then, finally, the response I've been waiting for. Interesting, Jordan murmured. If you come across anything you'd like to share, you know how to reach me. I ended the call, exhaling slowly, my grip on the phone tightening as the reality of what I had just said in emotion fully settled over me. Ryan had stolen everything from me, thinking that I would roll over, thinking that I would disappear, thinking that I was too weak to fight back. But now, the walls around him were starting to close in, and soon, he was going to know exactly how it felt to watch everything he built collapse into nothing. The first real sign of trouble for Ryan came in the form of silence. Not outright accusations, not public humiliation, not an immediate downfall, but something much worse. The absence of trust. It started subtly, with the people around him pulling back just a little, the casual conversations growing shorter, the once eager greetings now coming with a hint of hesitation. The colleagues who used to flock to him, who thrived on his influence, who treated him like the inevitable future of the company, suddenly weren't so eager to be seen standing too close. At first, he probably didn't notice it, too wrapped up in his own arrogance, too convinced that his world was untouchable. But as the days passed and the whispers turned into quiet, unspoken doubts, I knew. He was beginning to feel it. I had made sure of that. I had planted the seeds carefully, orchestrating the leaks, feeding the right information to the right people at the right time, ensuring that every little detail about his financial dealings, his questionable transactions, his reckless decisions started coming to light in a way that couldn't be ignored. I didn't need to fabricate anything. Ryan had left enough dirt behind on his own. All I had to do was make sure people started looking. And now they were. Ryan sat in his glass-walled office, staring at his phone like he could will it to ring, his fingers drumming against the desk in agitation he couldn't quite hide. He had been expecting updates, waiting for reassurance, waiting for someone, anyone, to come tell him that everything was under control. But all he got was silence. Then, finally, a knock on the door. When he looked up, expecting one of his usual allies, his expression shifted just slightly when he saw who was standing there instead: David Lancaster, the CFO of the company. Unlike Ryan, who had climbed the corporate ladder through a mix of charm, nepotism, and ruthless ambition, David was a numbers guy, a strategist, someone who dealt in cold, hard facts rather than empty promises. And right now, he looked at Ryan with the kind of measured caution that said everything without saying a word. Ryan forced a smile, leaning back in his chair like none of this concerned him, like the rumors weren't reaching him, like his entire career wasn't slowly slipping through his fingers. "David," he said, his voice smooth, practiced, but lacking the confidence it once carried. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" David didn't return the smile. Instead, he stepped inside, shutting the door behind him, his expression unreadable, his hands resting lightly on the chair across from Ryan's desk. "We need to talk," he said simply, his voice firm, controlled, the kind of tone that made it clear this wasn't a conversation Ryan could charm his way out of. Ryan exhaled sharply, schooling his expression into one of mock amusement, like this was all some kind of ridiculous misunderstanding. "All right," he said, spreading his hands. "Talk." David sat down, opening a folder and pulling out a printed spreadsheet, sliding it across the desk without a word. Ryan hesitated for a fraction of a second before picking it up, scanning the numbers, his eyes flicking over the very transactions I had exposed, the ones he had been so sure were buried deep enough that no one would find them. "These are," Ryan started, but David cut him off before he could spin another lie. "These are discrepancies, Ryan," he said, his voice sharp, clipped, not leaving room for negotiation. "And they don't look good. Someone's been asking questions. Internal audits are being reviewed, and I don't think I need to tell you what happens if the wrong people start digging too deep." Ryan forced a laugh, but it came out hollow, strained, lacking the usual confidence he carried so effortlessly. "David, come on," he said, leaning forward slightly, trying to regain control of the conversation. "We both know how corporate finance works. Things move around, numbers shift, this is nothing. Give me a day, and I'll have everything explained." David didn't blink. "You have until the end of the week," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "If you can't explain this in a way that keeps the board comfortable, you know what's going to happen next." Ryan's jaw tightened slightly, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair, the reality of the situation finally starting to sink in. He wasn't just facing minor scrutiny. This wasn't just some small inconvenience. This was real. While Ryan was fighting to keep his empire from collapsing, I was dealing with a different kind of fallout. Our parents. It didn't take long for them to hear about what was happening, for the rumors to reach them, for the repercussions of Ryan's mistakes to come knocking at their door. And instead of blaming him, instead of holding him accountable, instead of finally seeing him for who he really was, they did exactly what I expected them to do. They blamed me. "You didn't have to do this, Daniel." My mother's voice came through the phone, sharp with disappointment, as if I was some rebellious child instead of the one who had been wronged. "I don't know what you think you're accomplishing, but this isn't justice. This is just revenge." I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm, forcing myself not to laugh at the sheer absurdity of her words. "You do realize that Ryan stole from me, right?" I said, my voice measured, controlled despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "He took my company, drained my accounts, and left me with nothing. And now that he's finally facing consequences for something he actually did, you're blaming me?" My mother sighed, the kind of exhausted, dramatic exhale that she had perfected over the years, the kind meant to make me feel like I was being unreasonable. "Your brothers," she said, as if that was supposed to erase everything he had done. "Family forgives. Family finds a way to move past these things." I let out a humorless chuckle, shaking my head. "Funny," I said, "because when Ryan took everything from me, I don't remember you saying the same thing to him." A pause, a hesitation. Then, quietly, like she couldn't admit the truth out loud, "It's different." Of course it was. It had always been different. I didn't bother arguing. I didn't bother trying to make her see what she had spent years refusing to acknowledge. Instead, I simply said, "You should call Ryan. Something tells me he's going to need all the support he can get." And then I hung up. Back at his office, Ryan sat in silence, his fingers digging into his temples, his mind racing with a new kind of fear, one he had never felt before. He had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable, that no matter what mistakes he made, no matter who he burned along the way, there would always be a way out. But now, for the first time, he was realizing he might not make it out of this one. And soon, he would know exactly what it felt like to watch everything he built start slipping through his fingers. Ryan stormed into my apartment without knocking, his footsteps heavy, his breathing uneven, his entire presence radiating barely contained rage, as if he had spent the entire day trying to convince himself that this wasn't happening. I didn't look up right away, didn't acknowledge him immediately, didn't give him the satisfaction of thinking that his anger meant anything to me. Instead, I calmly finished pouring my coffee, stirring it with slow, deliberate movements, making sure that the silence between us stretched just long enough to drive him insane. "You think this is funny, don't you?" Ryan's voice was sharp, filled with pure frustration, the kind of anger that comes when someone realizes they're losing control but refuses to admit it. "You think I don't know what you're doing?" I finally turned to face him, lifting my cup to my lips, taking a slow sip, pretending to consider his words like I hadn't spent the last few weeks orchestrating every second of his downfall. "I have no idea what you're talking about," I said smoothly, leaning against the counter, my expression completely unreadable. Ryan let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair, his entire demeanor unraveling as the weight of everything that had been happening finally crashed down on him. "Bullshit," he spat, pointing a finger at me like he was desperately trying to hold on to whatever power he thought he had left. "The anonymous tips, the rumors, the audits, this didn't just happen. Someone's pulling the strings, and I know it's you." I tilted my head slightly, watching him, studying him, letting him see the complete lack of concern in my expression. "You're giving me a lot of credit, Ryan," I said, my voice calm, measured, steady in a way that made his own fury seem even more out of control. "Are you sure this isn't just karma finally catching up to you?" His jaw clenched, his fists curling at his sides, his entire body coiled with frustration. "You smug little," he stopped himself, exhaling sharply, forcing his emotions back under control, but I could see it now. The panic, the realization that he was on a sinking ship with no way off. I set my coffee cup down, straightening up, stepping closer, letting my voice drop just slightly, just enough to make him feel the shift in power between us. "Let's say, hypothetically," I began, my tone laced with careful amusement, "that I did have something to do with all of this. What exactly would you do about it?" Ryan blinked, his confidence faltering for just a second, just enough for me to know that he had nothing. He had spent his whole life winning by default, counting on his charm, his connections, his ability to lie his way out of every mistake. But now, he was drowning, and the one person who had always cleaned up his messes, our parents, couldn't save him this time. "You think you've won?" he said, but his voice lacked the conviction it once had. "You think ruining my career is going to fix anything?" I let out a slow breath, stepping even closer, lowering my voice just enough to make sure that he heard every word, every syllable that would cement the fact that he was standing in front of someone who was no longer playing by his rules. "Oh, Ryan," I said, my tone edged with something colder now, something final. "I haven't even started." The news broke the next morning. It wasn't just speculation anymore. It wasn't just whispers circulating behind closed doors, rumors passed along in hushed voices. It was a full-scale corporate scandal, splashed across headlines, dissected in financial reports, analyzed by every major news outlet that thrived on the downfall of the powerful. Ryan Carter, once the rising star of Lockwood Enterprises, was now the face of corporate fraud. I sat back, scrolling through the articles, sipping my coffee as I watched the narrative unfold exactly the way I had planned it. The evidence had been overwhelming, the kind of airtight proof that left no room for denials, no space for damage control, no path forward except complete destruction. The board of directors had already scrambled to distance themselves, releasing statements condemning internal misconduct and promising a thorough investigation, as if they hadn't been complicit the entire time. And Ryan? Ryan was finished. Back at my parents' house, the tension was thick enough to suffocate. Ryan sat in the living room, his face pale, his hands gripping the arms of the chair, as if letting go would send him spiraling into nothing. My mother stood by the window, silent, her lips pressed together, so tightly they had turned white, while my father paced back and forth, his jaw clenched, his entire body radiating undirected anger. Then, finally, my father turned to Ryan, his expression hardened, unreadable, but filled with something dangerously close to blame. "You've destroyed everything," he said, his voice cold, final. "Do you even understand what you've done?" Ryan let out a sharp, bitter laugh, shaking his head, finally snapping under the weight of everything that had come crashing down on him. What I've done, he repeated, his voice laced with resentment, his eyes flicking toward our parents with something that almost resembled contempt. No, Dad. This is what you raised me to be. My mother sucked in a sharp breath, her hand flying to her mouth, but Ryan wasn't finished. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, his entire body coiled with frustration, his voice rising with every word. You let me get away with everything, he snapped, his eyes dark, wild with desperation. You covered for me when I screwed up. You handed me opportunities one didn't deserve. You protected me every single time I should have faced consequences. And now, the second it doesn't work, the second it finally catches up to me, you want to pretend like I'm the only one responsible. Silence filled the room, heavy, suffocating, undeniable. Because for the first time in his life, Ryan was right. They had created this, and now they had to watch it burn. That evening, I received a single message. Ryan's number. You win. I hope it was worth it. I stared at the screen for a long moment, my chest tightening, my hands tightening around the phone, my mind replaying everything that had led to this moment. Then, slowly, I typed out a response. Not yet, but it will be. And with one final move, I pressed send on the last piece of evidence. By morning, Ryan wouldn't just be fired. He'd be blacklisted. Ryan had spent his entire life believing that rules didn't apply to him, that no matter what happened, no matter what mistakes he made, no matter who he screwed over, there would always be a way out. He had built his entire career on that illusion, climbing the corporate ladder with charm and manipulation, never once considering the possibility that he might actually run out of luck. But luck had never been the thing holding him up. It was protection. Our parents had always been there to shield him from the consequences of his actions, covering for him when he failed, making excuses when he got caught, pushing the blame onto someone else when things got out of hand. But this time, there was no one left to save him. I watched the fallout unfold in real time, my phone lighting up with news alerts, my inbox filling with messages from people who had once spoken Ryan's name with admiration, but were now pretending they had never been associated with him. Lockwood Enterprises had officially severed ties, releasing a public statement condemning gross financial misconduct within the company and making it very clear that Ryan was no longer employed. The moment the news hit, the ripple effect was immediate and brutal. Clients pulled out of deals, investors panicked, and every executive who had once praised Ryan's business instincts suddenly refused to take his calls. By the afternoon, he was trending. Senior VP terminated amid financial scandal. Once promising executive blacklisted from major firms. Sources say former Lockwood VP may face criminal investigation. That last one was my personal favorite, because while Ryan had been scrambling to control the damage, to beg his contacts to help him, to stop the freefall he was caught in, I had been busy making sure that the rumors turned into something real. The final piece of evidence, the one that tied him directly to fraudulent wire transfers, the one that made it impossible for anyone to defend him, the one that ensured no company would ever trust him again, had been sent to the right people at the right time. By the end of the week, he wasn't just unemployed. He was ruined. The first time he called me, I didn't answer. The second time, I let it ring long enough for him to think I might pick up, then decline the call. The third time, I finally let it go to voicemail. Daniel, I know you're listening to this. His voice came through the speaker, raw, strained, laced with desperation he couldn't quite hide. You went okay? You got what you wanted. I lost my job, my reputation, everything. Are you happy now? I took a slow sip of my coffee, listening to the sound of his breathing on the other end, the subtle wavering in his voice that told me he was barely holding it together. I know I screwed up, he continued after a long pause, his words slower now, carefully chosen, as if he was trying to find the exact thing that would get me to listen. And I know you're probably enjoying this, but I need help. You're the only one left. I exhaled slowly, tapping my fingers against the edge of the table, letting his words sink in, letting the reality of the situation settle over me. Ryan Carter, the same man who had stolen from me, sabotaged me, laughed in my face while I stood in the ruins of everything I built, was now sitting somewhere alone, watching his world collapse around him, with no one left to call but me. I had waited for this moment. I had dreamed of this moment. And yet, when it finally arrived, it didn't feel as satisfying as I thought it would. Because now I had a choice. That night, I met him at a bar, one of the ones we had gone to as kids, before life had turned us into enemies, before success had turned into a game of survival. He looked different now, disheveled, hollow-eyed, a man who had spent days trapped in his own personal hell. His suit, once perfectly pressed, looked wrinkled and ill-fitting, like he had thrown it on without thinking. His hands trembled slightly when he reached for his drink, the faintest sign of someone barely keeping it together. "You actually came," he muttered, staring down at the glass in front of him, his fingers tracing the rim in slow, distracted movements. I leaned back in my seat, studying him, watching him carefully, searching for any sign that this was just another manipulation, just another game. "You asked for help," I said simply, keeping my tone even, giving away nothing. "I wanted to hear what you had to say." He let out a slow, shaky breath, rubbing a hand over his face, his exhaustion bleeding into every movement. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, and for the first time, there was no arrogance in his voice, no bravado, no smug confidence, just fear. "No one will take my calls. My accounts are frozen. Lockwood made sure I won't get hired anywhere." He exhaled sharply, gripping his glass tighter. "I don't know how to fix this, Daniel." I tilted my head slightly, pretending to consider his words, pretending that I hadn't already made my decision before I even walked in here. "You want me to help you," I said, watching as he flinched slightly, as if hearing it out loud made it worse. He hesitated, his pride warring with his desperation, but finally he nodded. "I don't have anyone else." For a long moment, I just stared at him, letting the silence stretch between us, letting him feel the weight of everything he had done, letting him realize that this wasn't just about what he had lost, this was about what he had done to me. "You know," I said finally, my voice calm, deliberate, cold in a way that made his fingers tighten around his glass. "When you destroyed my business, when you took everything I worked for, when you watched me lose everything and didn't even hesitate, do you know what I felt?" Ryan swallowed hard, not answering, not speaking, not even looking at me now. "I felt nothing," I continued, leaning in slightly, lowering my voice just enough to make sure he heard every single word. "Because I knew, even then, that one day, you'd end up exactly where you are now." His breathing hitched, his hands gripping the table so tightly his knuckles turned white, and for the first time in his life I saw it, real fear. "You were right about one thing," I said, standing up slowly, tossing a few bills onto the table. "I did win." And then, without another word, I walked out of the bar, leaving him behind, alone, with the ruins of the life he had destroyed for himself. By morning, Ryan Carter's name would be officially blacklisted. And this time, there was no coming back. I thought it was over. I thought I had done everything I needed to do, that I had finally stripped Ryan of everything he had stolen, that I had watched his world collapse in a way that would ensure he never crawled his way back to the top. But life has a way of throwing one last punch just when you think you've caught your breath. And this time, the hit came from a direction I hadn't even thought to guard against. Because while I had been so focused on destroying Ryan's career, dismantling his reputation, making sure he was left with absolutely nothing, I had missed one final betrayal that had been sitting right in front of me the whole time. Ryan hadn't just stolen from me. He had stolen from our parents, too. I learned about it the way I had learned everything else, by accident, by digging through documents, by following a trail of mismanaged funds and conveniently missing transactions that had been ignored for far too long. But this wasn't some corporate fraud case, wasn't some scandal involving investors and business partners. This was personal. Buried beneath financial statements and bank records, hidden behind fake business expenses and offshore accounts, were withdrawals from our parents' retirement fund, transfers that had been disguised as temporary reallocations, money that had disappeared without a trace. Tens of thousands of dollars siphoned away, little by little, just like he had done to my company, just like he had done to Lockwood Enterprises. And the worst part? They had never even noticed. I didn't waste time. I drove straight to our parents' house, gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, my jaw locked in silent fury, my mind racing through every single conversation, every single excuse, every single lie Ryan had told them over the years. I had spent so much time resenting them for always taking his side, for defending him no matter what he did, for making me feel like I was the problem. But now, they were just as much as victims as I had been. My mother answered the door, her face tired, drawn, aged in a way that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with stress. The weight of what had happened to Ryan had clearly taken its toll on them, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sympathy. Not yet. Not until I knew the truth. "Daniel," she said, and I could hear the hesitation in her voice, the uncertainty of whether or not I was here to make things worse. "I didn't expect to see you." I stepped past her without waiting for an invitation, moving straight to the living room, gripping the folder in my hands so tightly that the edges of the paper curled under my fingers. "Where's Dad?" I asked, my voice sharp, leaving no room for small talk. She frowned, closing the door behind her, wringing her hands as she followed me inside. He's upstairs resting, she said, her voice careful, like she already knew whatever this was wasn't going to be good. He hasn't been doing well since everything happened with Ryan. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. Yeah, I muttered bitterly, throwing the folder onto the coffee table, watching as she flinched at the sound. And I bet you don't even know the half of it. Her eyes flickered with something close to fear, her hands gripping the back of the couch, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel, what's going on? I gestured to the folder, my jaw tight, my pulse hammering against my ribs. Why don't you take a look? She hesitated for a moment before slowly sitting down, her hands trembling as she opened the folder, her eyes scanning the documents, her breath catching in her throat as realization sank in like a knife. What is this? She whispered, her voice shaking, her fingers clutching the papers so tightly that they crumpled under her grip. Where did all this money go? I let out a slow, controlled breath, watching her, waiting for the truth to fully settle into her bones. Ryan took it, I said, my voice flat, emotionless. He drained your retirement fund the same way he drained my business. The same way he scammed his own company. The same way he's been screwing people over his entire life. Her hands started shaking harder, her breathing uneven, her entire body stiff with shock. No, she said, shaking her head, her voice barely audible. No, he wouldn't do that. He wouldn't. Look at the statements, Mom. I cut her off, my voice sharp, colder than I intended, but too far gone to stop myself. You're looking at proof. This isn't a misunderstanding. This isn't some mistake. He did this, and you let him. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears, her entire world breaking apart in real time. We trusted him, she whispered, and for the first time in my life, I actually saw it. Regret. Real, undeniable regret. But it was too late. I took a slow step back, my hands clenched in a fist at my sides, my breath steady despite the way my chest felt tight with years of resentment finally breaking free. I need you to understand something, I said, my voice quieter now, but no less deadly. This is the last time I clean up his mess. This is the last time I walk into this house and find out that you chose him over me. I am done. Tears spilled down her face now, her hands shaking, her voice desperate in a way I had never heard before. Daniel, please, she begged, reaching for me, her voice breaking in a way that should have made me feel something, but it didn't. I know we made mistakes. I know we should have done more, but please, don't do this. Don't walk away from us. I exhaled slowly, shaking my head, feeling the weight of all those years finally lifting off my shoulders. You walked away from me a long time ago, I said, turning toward the door, my voice quiet, final. I'm just finally doing the same. I didn't look back. I didn't let myself hesitate. I just walked out, and for the first time, I felt free. That night, I got a call from an unknown number. At first, I ignored it, but when the same number called again 5 minutes later, I finally picked up. Daniel Carter, a voice asked, smooth, professional, carrying the kind of authority that immediately made my pulse sharpen with interest. Who's asking? I said, keeping my voice calm, unreadable. My name is Vincent Hale, the man said, his tone laced with something that immediately put me on edge. I represent a group of investors who have been following your recent actions. We'd like to discuss a proposition. I frowned, gripping my phone tighter, my heart pounding just a little faster now. What kind of proposition? A pause. Then, finally, let's just say we think someone like you could be very useful. I exhaled slowly, my mind already calculating a dozen different possibilities. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The air in my apartment felt heavier than usual, thick with the weight of everything that had happened, with the kind of tension that comes when a person stands at the edge of something unavoidable, irreversible, something that will change everything. I sat at my desk, staring at my laptop screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, the glow of the screen casting sharp shadows across the room. The email was already half-written, the words carefully chosen, calculated, measured in a way that left no room for emotion, no room for hesitation, no room for anything except the decision I had to make. Vincent Hale's offer had been simple in theory, but complicated in every possible way that mattered. We're interested in someone like you, Daniel, he had said, his voice steady, smooth, carrying the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly how much power he held. You're strategic, you're efficient, and most importantly, you don't hesitate when it comes to getting things done. I had listened carefully, my expression giving away nothing, my mind running through every possible angle, every possible consequence, every possible outcome of what he was about to propose. You dismantled Ryan's career, Vincent had continued, his words deliberate, as if he had been watching the entire thing unfold like a chess match, fascinated by every move I had made. And in doing so, you created a void. A position that needs to be filled, connections that need to be salvaged, deals that still need to be closed, and then, finally, the offer itself. We want you to take his place. It had taken everything in me to keep my expression neutral, to keep my voice from betraying even a fraction of what I was thinking. You want me to step into the same role Ryan had? I had asked, my tone careful, unreadable. Vincent had smiled, a slow, knowing curve of his lips that told me he already knew exactly what I was thinking. We want someone better than Ryan. Someone who doesn't let ego get in the way. Someone who doesn't make sloppy mistakes. And that was when I had realized the truth. This wasn't just about replacing Ryan. This was about rewarding me for taking him down. Now, sitting alone in my apartment, staring at the email on my screen, I felt something cold settle deep in my chest. I had spent so much time tearing Ryan's world apart, making sure he lost everything, making sure that he finally knew what it felt like to be left with nothing. And now, I had been handed the chance to step into everything he had once taken for granted. A year ago, I would have laughed at the idea. 6 months ago, I would have rejected it outright. But now I wasn't sure. Because taking this deal didn't just mean accepting a job. It didn't just mean stepping into Ryan's position, picking up where he had left off, cleaning up the mess he had made. It meant becoming part of the same system that had allowed him to thrive for so long. It meant playing the same game he had played, but better, smarter, without the arrogance that had led to his downfall. It meant finally proving that I had always been the better one. But at what cost? I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, staring at the ceiling, my mind running through every possible outcome, every possible path that could come from this decision. If I took the offer, I would have power, influence, resources that I had never even dreamed of. I could build something bigger than my old business, something untouchable, something that Ryan himself had never been capable of creating. But if I walked away, if I turned my back on this, if I left it all behind, what would that mean? Would it mean that I was better than him? Or would it mean that, in the end, Ryan still won? My phone buzzed on the desk beside me, the name flashing on the screen like some cruel joke. Ryan. I stared at it for a long moment, the memory of his last message still fresh in my mind, the bitterness of it lingering like a stain I couldn't quite erase. You win. I hope it was worth it. I let the phone ring until it stopped, until the silence settled over me again, until I could hear nothing but the faint hum of the city outside my window. Then, without hesitating, I turned back to my laptop, my fingers moving over the keyboard with purpose, with precision, with the kind of certainty that had guided me through every single step of this plan. One last email, one final move, one decision that would determine everything. But as I hit send, as the screen refreshed and the message disappeared into the void, the audience would never see what it said. Because in the end, the only thing that mattered was that the game was over, and no one had really won.